In this unit, we're covering World War I, and always on the little title page, I like to kind of get the years and kind of get an outline of topics to kind of just review, get our brains going in the right direction to think on this topic, all right? So, the years I want you to get, okay, and I'm going to kind of spread these across the top here. The first year I want you to get is 1914. All right, important for you to know, in this year, I want you to know that war broke out in Europe, okay? And I want you to also know, again, to get our minds going in the right direction, that the U.S. is neutral here. Okay, following a policy of isolationism, where this war at the time is a European problem. All right, fast forward to the year 1917. Okay, a country that is involved in this war in Europe called Russia actually backs out. Okay, they turn communist. And in that same year, the United States of America will join. We join on the side of the Allies, okay? 1918. This is the year where actually the fighting stops, an armistice or a ceasefire is agreed on, and to officially bring an end to the war. That's going to come in 1919 with a signing of the Treaty of Versailles. I've heard some people say Versailles. I'm sure I'm saying a lot of these places wrong, but I think Versailles is going to be just fine. So technically, the full range of this war is from 1914 to 1919. But these dates in between are also very, very important for you to have as well. The first page that we have here on the war, this first little box actually discusses specifically why the war breaks out in Europe. There's a whole nother section about why we get involved. Please do not get the two confused. But why war breaks out in Europe, again, that year is 1914. We use the acronym in our class. We use the acronym of MANIA, okay? And the M standing for militarism. You're going to be writing something outside each one of these, so make sure you got plenty of space to do that. For militarism, a lot of these European countries were competing with one another, competing for bigger and stronger militaries, which is the reason it's called militarism. The two countries competing the most and doing this the most are arguably Britain and Germany. But again, this is going to cause a lot of tension in the region, all right? There's actually alliances that were formed prior to this war breaking out. I want you to know that some of these alliances, some were known and some were secret. And come to find out, a couple of these secret alliances are going to be what causes this war to be a lot larger than what I think was pretty much initially intended, okay? So having mostly secret alliances is going to be an issue. This word nationalism, some people will say that nationalism and patriotism are the same thing. Not necessarily, okay? There is some correlation there, but they are not words that can be used interchangeably. But nationalism, as far as what's going on in Europe, I want you to remember that there are people groups throughout Europe. I'm going to put people groups, specific people group that we're talking about at the time. It's called the Slavs. They want what is known as self-determination. This is also known as self-rule. They want to establish their own independent nations, to be able to rule over themselves. All right. So again, that's going to cause some tension. That there's some people groups throughout Europe that are being controlled by bigger empires like Austria-Hungary and Germany and places like that. Okay. Imperialism. These European nations, like we discussed in our last unit, have been traveling around the whole world for hundreds of years, claiming territory throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, okay? And come to find out, there are some places around the world that they argued over. So there's already a lot of tension from the past over arguing over some of these areas. So I want you to write that these European nations are competing over land, their colonies, by the way, throughout places like Africa and Asia. And that brings us to the last cause of the war. This is also considered, and I'm going to draw little stars, the spark of the war. And the reason it's called the spark of the war is all these above it: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism. Those are things that have been compiling over time. This event is what's going to, in combination with all the ones that I just put a dot beside, this is going to be the one where everything is going to blow up and we are going to get what we now study as being World War I. Okay? As far as assassination goes, you need to know who was assassinated. Okay? And his name was Franz Ferdinand, along with his wife, actually. He is going to be the heir, the next person in line to the throne, to the empire of Austria-Hungary. All right, again, some people say Hungary. Austria-Hungary is how we're going to say it, okay? And he is killed by a terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. Man who actually killed him, his name, I believe you pronounce it Gavrilo Princip. Close enough. But this Black Hand is from the country of Serbia. And I want to draw a line or an arrow from assassination to nationalism, because the reason why Franz Ferdinand was assassinated was because of the Slavic community that Austria-Hungary had control over, and they wanted self-determination. So it is connected to the nationalism that we see throughout this part of Europe known as the Balkan Peninsula. All right? So, over here with allies, these alliances over here on the left were the alliances that were prior to World War I breaking out. So you can kind of trace both of these back to this issue here. All right. More importantly, you need to know the alliances that were during the war. All right. As you can see, Britain and France and Russia are going to be pretty much the three original members of the Allied powers. Russia is going to leave in 1917, okay? And what I want you to write above that is they leave because they experienced something called the Russian Revolution. Talk about this more in a second. The Russian Revolution, where Vladimir Lenin takes over Russia and establishes it as a communist nation and surrenders to Germany. And then after Russia leaves, the United States, because of their own set of problems, winds up joining. But one of the reasons why we also join is because when Russia backs out, because of Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy, we can now kind of feel better about joining this alliance. Now, Italy's a little wishy-washy here. Italy had previously been in an alliance with the other side. And that is a whole nother lesson in itself. But ultimately, what winds up happening is at the outbreak of this war, Italy goes from being in an alliance with like Germany and Austria-Hungary to joining the Allied powers, okay? And then the three empires that make up these central powers, okay? And if you actually looked at a map of Europe, which I do have on the next page, and then we're going to break it down here in just a second, is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. All right. So I actually we're going to be flipping back and forth from this page to the next one, which is actually a blank map of what this area, of what Europe looked like at the time. So I want you to actually pull this map out, and we're going to do some labeling here, all right? I want you to label up here that this little island is Britain. Right below it, we have the country of France. Over here, we have Russia. And down here, like the little boot that everybody always talks about, is Italy. And those are going to be the main countries that make up the Allied powers in Europe before we get involved in 1917. So I actually want to change colors with my pen here. And let's label the central powers. And again, if you kind of look at Europe as a whole here, right in the middle for the central powers, we have Germany. This is the German Empire. Here is Austria, Hungary. And down here we have the Ottoman Empire. All right. So believe it or not, understanding a little bit about the geography of Europe is going to help some of this make sense. All right. So let's jump back to the page before that we were just on. In this war, we have two main battle fronts. Okay, so the war fronts we have are the Western Front, which is between Germany and France, and then we have the Eastern Front, which is between Germany and Russia. Now, as far as Germany goes, and I'm going to flip to the next page, you don't have to, Germany geographically is at a disadvantage. Okay, and they are at a disadvantage because they are located here in the middle with an enemy from the Allied powers on both sides of them. So, if you look up military strategy and things like that, you will find that one of the last things that a country wants to do is fight on two fronts. And what we mean by two fronts here, again, between Germany and France, this is one front here, and then this between Germany and Russia would be another. So, to prevent that from happening, going back to the page that we were on, Germany actually comes up with a plan, and I know that I'm going to butcher the name of this, but that's okay. The Schlieffen Plan, okay? And this is their plan, and I want you to write, plan to avoid fighting a two-front war. What this plan entails, all right, is they want to attack France first, hurry up and defeat France is the plan, then attack Russia once France has been defeated. And this is actually a good plan because Russia is the least industrialized nation that's going to be fighting against Germany. So it's actually going to take them a little while to what we call mobilize or get ready for war. So here's their plan. Germany going to attack France first, and then they will attack Russia. All right. You need to know, coming back to this right here, that this plan failed. It failed miserably, and the reason that it failed is because when they fight on the Western Front, right here, okay, on my map, I'm going to label it. They experience a type of warfare called trench warfare, which if you were in class with me, we talked a good deal about this. And if not, if you're from some other school and you're watching this as a review to prepare you for your test, it's worth looking up. We talked about no man's land, the terrible conditions in the trenches, and basically what this leads to is called a war of attrition, where Germany thought they were going to be able to just march into France, hurry up and defeat France. It turns into a war of attrition in the trenches, where basically they are fighting in these trenches and neither side is really gaining enough of ground to kind of, win. So what Germany winds up having to do is not only fight France in the trenches, but they do wind up having to fight Russia at the same time. So this Schlieffen Plan, again, I know I'm butchering that name, it winds up failing for them. All right. Down here, as far as technology goes, I have all the technologies listed there. Artillery, again, trench warfare. We got no man's land, that was on the Western Front. Poisonous gas. Tanks, even though they weren't very effective, we thought that they were going to help. I say we thought. Our allies thought they were going to help tremendously over the trenches. They were mostly a whole lot more trouble than what they were worth. And then there was actually airplanes at the time, but we're not going to see as much what we would call dogfights, battles in the air, as what we're going to see in World War II. Our weaponry is going to be much more advanced in World War II than it is here in this war, all right? But these technologies, the thing that you need to know about them is they cause massive casualties. To be honest with you, and I discuss this when I teach this topic in class, is technology had improved, but our fighting strategies had not. And so we kind of still had this mindset that you've probably seen old movies like the Civil War and the American Revolutionary War, where the two opposing sides meet up on a battlefield and they're in close proximity to one another. Well, they had to be, because their technology, their weapons, were not good at long distance. But now that technology has advanced, we are actually better at killing people at longer distances, but we still have this mentality of close proximity. So not keeping up with the technology, that's also going to kind of contribute to the amount of casualties and fatalities that we have in this war. All right. So the question is what was the United States doing in 1914? Remember, this is the year that war broke out in Europe. Well, what are we doing? We're not in Europe. We're over here in North America. Okay. We're literally in a whole nother hemisphere. So our president, Woodrow Wilson, remember him. His foreign policy was moral diplomacy. Remember, that's where he does not plan on aiding or trading with any country that is not a democracy. So I'm going to kind of highlight up here. Remember, it's kind of our issue with Russia. There is they were not a democratic nation, and they were a part of the Allies in 1914. And so a lot of public opinion, we're going to see Woodrow Wilson is going to declare the United States neutral. We are not going to side with the Allied powers, nor are we going to side with the Central Powers. The reason we do this, and please write this, the reason we declare ourselves neutral, okay, I'm going to draw a little arrow over here, is because we follow a policy known as, in all capital letters, isolationism. All right. Isolationism, which was a policy our very first president in this country suggested that we follow. And I'm sure there's a more proper way of explaining this, but how I get my kids to understand it is isolationism is where George Washington tells us we need to stay away from European nations. We need to stay away from them. They have a lot of drama. They have a lot of issues. And he was right, because if you actually study European history, you're going to be studying a whole bunch of wars that have lasted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so he's right. Like, hey, stay away from Europe because they like to fight and they're going to pull you into all of their issues. So since George Washington's presidency, we have tried to do our best at following this policy of isolationism. So here it is. Europe has blown up into this massive war. Come to find out, George Washington was very much right. And we're going to declare ourselves neutral because we are following this policy of isolationism. But in our country, all right, we actually have immigrants, especially that had just come through like during the Gilded Age. Some of these immigrants, these new immigrants, came from places like Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so they're going to kind of support their homeland. Okay, it kind of makes sense. Even though they're here, they've got family, they've got loved ones back in those countries. They may still feel a close connection to the culture and the people there. And so in their minds, they're supporting those countries, which, a little bit of a spoiler alert here, that's not going to be the side we join. We don't join the Central Powers. We join the Allied Powers. So, to be honest with you, one of the biggest reasons, and I'm going to highlight it here, a lot of our businesses and our banks, the things that our economy thrives off of, they supported two countries in the Allied Powers, Britain and France, because we do a lot of business with them. It's selfish. We do a lot of business. We also are a little bit more closely tied to their culture and their forms of government than what we would be with the Central Powers. But guys, this is so very important. Just the brutal honesty of it all is our economy is very closely tied to those of Britain and France. So if there's any side of this war that we are going to take, it is going to be Britain and France's, okay? But right now, in 1914, we're not taking sides. Again, we are declaring ourselves neutral. All right, so jumping to the next page of notes, it should look something like this. What changes? How do we go from being neutral to getting involved in this war? So in this first box, we have reasons why we actually declared war in World War I. So how we go from being neutral and isolated to getting involved in this conflict, okay? Unrestricted submarine warfare is the first thing that's listed here. And then we have the Zimmermann telegram, the Russian Revolution, and down here I have stars beside the continuation of unrestricted submarine warfare and Germany breaking what was called the Sussex Pledge. Okay, now getting back up here to unrestricted submarine warfare, I want you to write number 1 beside it. Change my ink back. And also down here, number 1 beside the continuation of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, back up here, first of all, we have these U-boats, okay? And what these are, they are German submarines. And these German submarines are pretty fatal when it comes to warfare out in the waters, because they can easily go undetected. We didn't have the technology of sonar at the time. We're not going to have that until later, closer to World War II. So these U-boats are engaging in something called unrestricted submarine warfare, where practically they are sinking anything and everything that they come across, whether it is battleships, whether it is war supply ships, or passenger ships, which brings us to, and I'm going to highlight it, the Lusitania, all right? And this is a British passenger ship that is sunk by German U-boats. All right, so it is sunk by these U-boats. The issue, because this is a British passenger ship, so you may be thinking, well, what does that have to do with the United States of America? It had American citizens on it that perished, all right, on this ship. And so that was done, and I think it is important for you to know that this was in 1915. So you can't say that the Lusitania is the reason why, because we know, if we look up here in the title, we don't actually declare war until 1917. And even after, I'm going to zoom in here, even after the Lusitania is sunk, another ship known as the Sussex, same situation here, is sunk, and some Americans perish on this ship as well. Well, that is where we get what's called the Sussex Pledge. Think of this pledge as a promise, okay? And this is Germany's promise to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. They are going to start doing what's called restricted warfare. They're going to start giving ships that are not battleships, that are not involved in the war, opportunities to turn around, to change their course, to be stopped and searched. They are no longer going to just sink them simply because they come across a ship. So they make this pledge to us after the sinking of the Sussex, like, hey, we're going to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. It is important to note that Germany has no intentions of actually keeping this promise. And that leads us to what is called the Zimmermann Telegram. And the word telegram, this means a message. And this message was intended to go from Germany to Mexico. And what this message was asking, all right, we've actually got quite a few details we need to get here. What this message was asking, and number one, is it was asking Mexico to become an ally to Germany, and for Mexico to declare war on the United States. In this telegram, it also states that Germany will reward Mexico territory that actually had previously belonged to them, and that territory are our current states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Okay, and but I tell you all those details to kind of spoil it and say this message never even made it to Mexico. They will be our ally, Britain, intercepts this message and gives it to the United States of America. All right? So before the message could ever even make it to Mexico, Britain intercepts it and kind of gives it to the United States. Britain had been kind of wanting us to get a little bit more involved in this conflict on the side of the Allies. So the reason they turned this over to us, because they understand that this will be motivation, kind of adding fuel to the fire of getting us geared up, ready for war. But also, what we're going to see here with this message, the purpose of it is Mexico is right below the United States of America. So if Germany can convince them to declare war on us, that's going to occupy us over here on our homeland. And Germany is going to be able to continue their war efforts in Europe without having to worry about, at the time, any interference from the United States of America, because we are clearly not going to send troops across the Atlantic to fight in Europe if we have a war with a country going on that is literally at our southern border. So, backfires on Germany, never even makes it. Britain intercepts it and gives it to us. Something else that we get that is going to encourage our involvement is the Russian Revolution. Okay, and I'm going to come over on this side to write a little bit about this. The Russian Revolution is when the guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they take over Russia and they establish the first communist nation that we know as the Soviet Union. And the first thing that Vladimir Lenin does, and there is honestly a whole backstory to Germany actually having Vladimir Lenin in one of their prisons and releasing him to go do all of this. But when he takes over Russia and establishes it as a communist nation, and he becomes the leader of the first communist nation, the first thing he does is surrender to Germany. And there are two reasons why this motivates us to get involved. Is because of Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. We no longer have to worry about that being applicable, because Russia not being a democratic nation is one of the reasons why Woodrow Wilson would have been hesitant to help the Allies. But now they're no longer in the Allies. They've backed out of this war. Another reason why this is going to encourage our involvement is because this weakens the Allies. They're kind of one man down. But the number one reason we get involved is because Germany breaks the Sussex Pledge. They continue, right here it says the continuation of unrestricted submarine warfare. They break that promise and again, they had no intentions of keeping it in the first place, but they break that promise to stop sinking ships without warning, okay? And over here, we have this word, mobilization. And mobilization for war. You need to be familiar what the word mobilization is actually talking about. And how I explain it is it talks about how we get ready. We're not going to just jump straight into this war. Once war is declared by Congress, there are some things that we have to do to transition into this war. We actually declare war in April of 1917, and if I'm not mistaken, we are not fully mobilized and ready until the beginning of 1918. So let's talk about some of the things that our country did to get ready for war. The first thing they create is the War Industries Board. Go ahead and highlight all that's bolded here. The National War Labor Board, Food and Fuel Administration. I'm going to highlight money. We're going to have money to pay for this war. We're going to need soldiers, and we're also going to need some support for this war. All right? Now, what I'm going to be adding in pencil is one thing I teach my classes is like, hey, pay attention to the words. Sometimes laws and organizations, like if you actually pay attention to the name of them, it kind of gives away what they did. So this first one, like industries, our factories are going to turn into what we call munitions factories. The government is going to choose certain factories and give them contracts, and they are going to transition from making everyday goods to making war equipment, to making munitions. So that's the first thing. We got to get war equipment produced. The next organization that we're going to see is the National War Labor Board, and another word for labor is work. The main goal of this organization, okay, their goal is to prevent workers from going on strike. All right, so to prevent strikes, this is extremely important. They try to go into these factories that the government has contracted, and they get these factories to up the pay, extra money for extra hours and things like that to make the working environment as attractive as possible so that these workers will have no motive to go on strike. We can't have them going on strike. They're producing war equipment. We have to have war equipment in order to actually win the war. And the names Food and Fuel Administration, they actually, again, give away what they focused on but the big thing that they had to make sure is that there was enough food and fuel for not only our people at home, but for especially our soldiers that we're going to be sending into Europe. So the main thing that these organizations focused on is something called rationing, limiting how many pounds of sugar you can have at home, like how much meat you can purchase. And so during this time of war, you're not going to be able to go to the store and buy all of the products that you want. You're going to be limited. It's going to be rationed out to make sure that we have enough for us and our soldiers. The next one, wars are expensive. Congress knows that, and so they're going to try to come up with a way to help fund this war. They are going to raise people's income tax, and they're going to sell war bonds. And I'm going to put a number 1 out beside war bonds because that's actually the way that they raise the most money. And to just kind of make war bonds make sense a little bit, war bonds is when you ultimately give the government money. You give them money. For this case, you're giving them money to help win this war. Hey, use my money however it needs to be used to help fund this war so that we are successful. And you're given some form of certificate talking about how much you gave in this war bond. And the reason that this is a motivation, because to be honest with you, I don't care how patriotic you are, we don't have people just throwing money at the government. Like, hey, here's some money, use it to make our country better, use it to make our country successful. That just doesn't happen. So there has to be a motivation. So the way a bond works is whatever money you gave to the government, later on you can go and cash in that bond. You can get your money back, and it has accrued interest over time. So you actually get back more money than what you gave once our economy is back operating on a non-war related economy and things like that. So war bonds are extremely attractive because it's an opportunity for you to make more money than what you gave. Soldiers, the Selective Service Act. I'm going to highlight that. I do not know why students have such a hard time remembering what this is. And again, the name gives it away. Somebody says, hey, I'm joining the service. They are joining the military, guys. Okay. Now, what the Selective Service Act is when the government selects who goes into the service. And how they do that is they hold a draft, also known as conscription. We need soldiers. I'd have to go back and look at the exact details, but we have a couple of million men volunteer, and then we draft a couple of million soldiers as well. All right, so we need soldiers in order to win this war. The next one, the actual name of the organization, I should have highlighted it as well, is the Committee on Public Information. And the main focus here is getting the public's support for the war. And they are going to get this support by using what's called propaganda. The most popular form of propaganda is through a lot of posters, but it can be poems, it can be speeches, it can be like movie clips. Like if you go to the theaters and there's a little clip at the beginning of the movie encouraging you to and grow victory gardens or buy war bonds and to make sure you're rationing and things like that. So basically the goal of this committee is to make sure that the public at home is doing everything within their power to actually make this war possible to win. All right. Now down here, as far as the minorities that we get, we're specifically talking about African Americans and women. African Americans in World War I and World War II actually are going to be forced to fight in segregated units separate from white units. And that's in the military. But at home, we get a very important migration pattern. And what the Great Migration is, okay, again, this is just African Americans, talking about African Americans, and they are migrating from the south to the north. And I have said it in units before this one, just to make life a little bit easier. The number one reason anybody migrates or immigrates into American cities, all right, so their number one reason are for jobs, and in this particular case, jobs in munitions factories. So a lot of white men are going to volunteer and be drafted into this war. Of course, some African American men as well, but majority white. And so that's going to actually leave a whole lot of job availability in these munitions factories up north. We again get a possible push-pull effect from this migration. There are reasons why these African Americans are wanting to leave the South, and this is the push. Okay, these are the bad things that they are experiencing in the South. They're experiencing things like racism, discrimination, or let me put it like this: extreme racism and extreme discrimination, very little job opportunities, terrible housing. Okay, and the pull is the good stuff that the North has to offer. Okay, and the number one good thing, again, jobs in these munitions factories, less, and that is important to remember, less discrimination, less racism than what they are experiencing in the South. It's just flat out a better opportunity for them as blacks in northern cities. For women, we're going to see women actually are going to be allowed in the military, but very strict about what they can and cannot do. Under no circumstances are they supposed to be involved in any combat positions. Okay, so non-combat positions is what they are offered. Things like nurses, office workers, things like that. At home, women are going to actually have to get out of their normal gender roles, which is at home, cooking, cleaning, raising the kids, things like that. Women are going to not necessarily be forced, but they are going to be asked to go into the factories, okay? They are going to be producing war equipment. And we need them in these factories because, yet again, a lot of our men are now going to be in the service, whether they drafted or volunteered, and we're going to be sending them to Europe to fight this war. All right? The next one, so very important. I'm actually going to choose a different highlighter to just emphasize this whole section here. A lot of your freedoms are limited anyways. You have the freedom of speech, but there are certain circumstances where if you say certain things, you can be punished. You can go to jail, so on and so forth. So it's important to understand your freedoms are limited as is, but especially during a time of crisis, during a time of war, your freedoms can be so limited to where they can almost be non-existent. So let's talk about a couple of very important laws passed, the Espionage Act as well as the Sedition Act. And for espionage, another word for espionage is spying. So, of course, during this time of war, we are going to make it illegal for you to give any information to any enemy source that could help them gain an advantage. You being used as a spy to gather intelligence to give them an advantage. Super illegal. All right. Now, the next one is the Sedition Act. And specifically, what the Sedition Act is going to focus on is you cannot engage any speech, despite your freedom of speech, or any expression of opinion, including written. So if you write something, you publish something, that's going to be included, that is going to cast any doubt on the war effort. If what you are saying or what you are printing or what you are writing is going to harm the chances we have of being successful in this war, you don't have that freedom. It is stripped from you, despite what the Constitution says. And if you don't believe me, look at these two instances where Eugene Debs was speaking out against the war and our involvement in it. He gets arrested for breaking the Sedition Act. Charles Schenck gets arrested for publishing some pamphlets that were these anti-draft pamphlets encouraging young men to not register for the draft. Well, that's seen as a threat to our war effort because we have to have soldiers in order to win. And here he is trying to get men to not even register for the draft. So I'm actually going to bracket these two men together and draw an arrow to the Sedition Act because that's what they get in trouble for. Now, Charles Schenck did try to challenge this because he's looking at the Constitution, he's looking at the freedoms that it says that he has, and he basically states that he can print whatever he wants to, that he has the freedom of speech. He can say these things. If he doesn't think soldiers should be registering for the draft, he can say that. That's what he thought. But when the Supreme Court looked at the situation, they looked at our position in this war, they did not say that he did not have the freedom of speech, but they did say that your freedoms cannot create, and here is extremely important, I'm going to highlight it and I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to circle it, cannot create a clear and present danger. You cannot yell bomb on an airplane and then when they're slapping handcuffs on you say, oh, you can't do this. I've got the freedom of speech. You're going to cause widespread panic on a plane that's at a few thousand feet in the air. It's probably going to end badly for not just you, but in the chaos for everybody involved. You created a clear and present danger with your speech. So this is where they get Charles Schenck. And they was like, no, we realize you've got this freedom, but you cannot use this if it creates a clear and present danger. And it does create a clear and present danger for this country if we lose this war because you're convincing men to not register for the draft. So he gets in trouble. His fight in the courts was to no prevail of his. All right. The next one, so very important, guys. And this is today, this is yesterday, this is tomorrow. Your personal freedoms can be limited even more than what they already are, or they can literally be completely removed if it is seen as necessary for national security. The government is going to choose the security of the nation over protecting your freedoms every single day. They will strip you of your freedoms if they think that what they are doing is for the betterment of this nation. Bottom line, okay? Doesn't seem very fair, but that is how it is. Moving on to the next page in this unit and our last page, if I was a betting person, if I was a gambling person, this is the topic that is going to probably pop up on your state test, all right? The topic of Woodrow Wilson coming up with the peace plan known as the 14 points, what his peace plan was, and what is actually put into the Treaty of Versailles. And even farther into understanding, after all those efforts, we don't even sign the Treaty of Versailles. We don't even join something called the League of Nations. And it was a whole bunch of effort and a whole bunch of thought put into something that we actually step away from. So, to start with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, okay, this is his peace plan. He starts coming up with this before the war is ever even over. Everybody knows that once America is involved, the Allies are going to be victorious. And we are, okay? And so Wilson kind of starts looking at, okay, what can we do to maintain peace after this? What can we do to prevent another devastating war like this one from ever happening again? The world had never seen a war like what we call World War I. They called the Great War. And a lot of people saw how devastating it was, and they even called it the war to end all wars, which we know to not be true, but that's the devastation that it had on this world. So here's his peace plan. He's like, this is the things that we need to do to make sure that this never happens again. And Woodrow Wilson is smart. He actually looks at what caused World War I, mania, that first little section we went over in this unit, and he was like, let's look at what caused this problem in the first place. Fix that so that history does not repeat itself. Now, a lot of these things that he promotes, our allies, Britain and France, did agree with some of these points. But for the most part, they did not think that his plan was harsh enough on Germany. We're going to learn that our allies, Britain and France, have a goal of punishing Germany after this war to making them so weak, putting so many limitations on their country to where they don't have the opportunity to cause another war like this. Again, we know this fails miserably because we get World War II in roughly about 20 years or so. But that's going to be kind of their mindset, is a little bit of vengeance. Okay, but for Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the first thing that he wants to get rid of are those secret alliances. Again, one of the causes of the war was alliances. That's a part of that acronym MANIA that we've discussed. He's actually going to encourage all countries to reduce their militaries. Yet again, one of the causes of this war was militarism. These European countries competing over having bigger and stronger and better armies than each other. So let's kind of level out the playing field here. He also encouraged us to have free trade with one another. He is thoroughly convinced that if you are doing a lot of trade with another country and your economies are kind of tied together, that you're less likely to have conflicts with that country because of the business that you do with one another. Now, the next one does take some explanation, and I do want you to write what he means by freedom of the seas. He's talking about the Lusitania here. He's talking about unrestricted submarine warfare, where these German U-boats were going around and just sinking anyone and everyone that they were coming across. They did not distinguish between warships and merchant ships and good ships and stuff like that. So what he means by freedom of the seas is he basically says it doesn't matter where the ships are. Okay, I'm going to write and this is going to this. I just need some room. Military ships should be protected, should be safe, even in times / areas of war. So he's saying if it's not a battleship, it doesn't matter who is at war with who. If it's not a battleship, that ship should not have to worry about being a potentially damaged by two countries that are at war with one another. So freedom of the seas. Another thing he wants to address is, again, one of those causes of the war, which was nationalism. He says, hey, those people groups in Europe that want their own countries and want to rule over themselves, they want self-determination, let's give it to them. Let's give the Slavic community, let's give them their own identity as a nation. And his last and most popular suggestion was to create a peacekeeping organization, a group of countries that work together to prevent war, to maintain peace in this world. Like, that's their main focus. And what he's referencing is what will become known as the League of Nations. So, very good idea, but keep in mind, it's his idea, but he does not have the authority in our country as president to decide whether or not we join something like the League of Nations. But great idea. Now, getting over here to the actual treaty itself, the Treaty of Versailles actually took several meetings to kind of draw up, and these meetings actually take place at something called the Paris Peace Conference, where the Allies would get together and they would decide, like, okay, what are we going to put in this treaty? What is Germany going to be responsible for as the losers, as well as Austria-Hungary? What are we going to do to try to prevent this from happening again? There's so many details that have to go into the treaty, which is the reason why this peace conference, there's several meetings that take place. So Woodrow Wilson is actually making several trips to Paris, France, to help draw up this treaty. And the number one thing you've got to know about this treaty is it was extremely harsh on Germany. Which was not Woodrow Wilson's intentions at all. But these are the things that the treaty is going to require of Germany. The first thing, they have to reduce their military to only 100,000 troops. For a standing army at the time, that's not difficult, but to only have 100,000 troops with the potential of going to war, you're not going to be successful at all. So that's kind of the mindset of our allies. Like, yeah, we're going to let them have a military, but not one large enough to actually do any damage. They have to pay reparations. They're going to have to pay billions of dollars of war debt to Britain and France. Britain and France, especially France, was heavily damaged in this war by Germany. And so Germany is going to be expected to start making yearly payments to France and to Britain for the cost that they caused them to have during this war. Germany's economy is going to be trashed after World War I. When the first year of payments comes up, there's no chance of them being able to pay it. They struggle to pay these reparations, and it keeps their economy in a depression for many years until later on they get Hitler, to be honest with you. And here's the one that always tickles me, is they actually make Germany take blame for the war. And we've already discussed what caused this war in Europe. Again, the acronym MANIA. Well, none of them said Germany. And so the point here is it's really easy as victors to kind of point the finger at the losers and say, you're going to accept this as punishment. Because what other choice did Germany have? So they do, in the part of the treaty, they have to sign a section called the War Guilt Clause, where when they sign the section, they are saying, like, this whole thing is my fault. This whole thing, this whole war is laid on the shoulders of Germany. And when they signed this part, it made it real easy to enforce them, to enforce the fact that they got to pay reparations, they got to reduce their militaries. They have signed confessing that this is all their fault. Another issue that's going to come up is, and this typically happens in war anyways, is land is actually going to be taken away from Germany and other countries, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. They're going to lose land too. But specifically for Germany, a couple of countries are going to be created from land that had previously been a part of the German Empire, and they're going to play a huge role in World War II, and that is Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now, a couple of things that our allies did incorporate from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points is the next one. They actually did allow for the creation of new nations. We get 9 new nations in Europe. So I actually have a map to show you here. On the left, okay, because remember, here's Germany. Here's the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Down here was the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that the map looks drastically different afterwards. So I'm going to change my colors here. So here's Poland that I was talking about, and Czechoslovakia. You can see Austria-Hungary is broken up. We get the country of Yugoslavia. We'll get Finland up here. These little countries. So you can see, like, literally the geographical makeup of Europe changes drastically. Down here, Yugoslavia, that's going to be where a lot of that Slavic community, going back to like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that's where a lot of that Slavic community, that's their self-determination that they wanted, all right? So that's what we mean by 9 new nations. And then another thing that they did agree with is creating a peacekeeping organizations, to create the League of Nations. So again, make sure you notice, like, hey, allow self-determination. They took that from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Create a League of Nations. They took that. They agreed with that. Okay? For the most part, the other things they didn't fully agree with. But here is the important thing, and I need to kind of fix this. There's a typo, and it's probably in your paper as well. It says, except the U.S. would not, and I'm going to mark out these 2 words. Doesn't make sense with them in there. except the U.S. would not sign the treaty or join the League of Nations. So we didn't sign this treaty or join the League of Nations. And this box down here at the very bottom, all of it, I need to change highlighting, okay? This box is so extremely important. You're not going to see a question on state tests that says, did the United States join the League of Nations, and have such an easy answer with no. You got to know why. Why did we not join the League of Nations? Why did we not sign the Treaty of Versailles? Because signing treaties does not necessarily fall into the hands of the President of the United States of America. Senate, which is part of Congress, they are the ones who have the power to sign treaties for our country. So when they sit down and they look at this treaty and what all this treaty is doing and what it will require is from everybody who signs, they don't like what they see. All right. So this whole box, reasons why we did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. Number one issue was with the League of Nations. If we sign this treaty, if we join the League of Nations, the U.S. Senate, okay, again, who is part of Congress, and Congress is the people who get to decide whether or not this country goes to war. They look at how the League of Nations would operate and they say, this will clearly take away our power to declare war. Because as a member of the League of Nations, if any country within our League of Nations is threatened by an outside country, we work as a military alliance. We are vowing that we will go to war to aid any country in this league with us. So, in a sense, without Congress ever even approving or declaring war, we could be pulled into conflicts, pulled into wars without their approval if we join the League of Nations. And they don't like that. They say no. In the U.S. Constitution, it gives the power to declare war to Congress, and we're not going to join anything that takes or strips that power from us. So that's what I have highlighted right here with number one. It would take away their power to declare Congress. Another way, or another issue that we had, is we want to stay out of all these foreign entanglements, all of these foreign affairs, especially with Europe. Remember, we have followed a policy of isolationism, and there we are going to return to that, because Europe has a lot of issues. The likelihood, if we joined the League of Nations, of being pulled into a major conflict in Europe was actually rather high. So, Senate's going to say we're not going to sign this treaty because it will require us to join the League of Nations, and we're not going to become a member of the League of Nations because we don't want to be involved in every single conflict that these European countries have. We are going to return to isolationism. And the last page for this unit is a couple of things that we did when this war is over. We've actually already talked about the 14 points. We've already talked about the Treaty of Versailles, how we do not join it. But I want to talk about the Dawes Plan. Please do not confuse the Dawes Plan with the Dawes Act, which is where we tried to assimilate Native Americans. The Dawes Plan, okay, I have a little graph, little flow chart, I guess, here discussing what the Dawes Plan was. And where this chart actually starts, it actually starts here with the United States of America. We gave loans, we gave money to Germany, which, please remember, was our enemy during World War I. So you may be thinking, we are giving these folks that we just defeated in this war, we're giving them money. Yes, and the reason we're giving them money is because Germany has to pay reparations. Remember, that was a part of the treaty. They've got to pay these reparations to Britain and France. Okay, so we are helping give Germany money so that Germany can give their money to Britain and France. Because look, Britain and France actually owe us money. The main purpose, and I want you to write this, and I'll do a little bit more explaining. The main purpose of the Dawes Plan was to help Europe's, especially, I'm going to put in parentheses here, especially the main countries we were focused on were Britain and France. All right, let's zoom in. To help Europe's economy get back on track. To be honest with you, there was a selfish motive behind this. The main economies that we're worried about in Europe are those of Britain and France. Britain and France were heavily damaged financially and physically for France by Germany in this war, and their economy is really going to be struggling when the war is over if they don't get these reparations from Germany. So we don't want that to happen because we do a lot of trade and a lot of business with Britain and France. We want their economies to be as stable as possible because their economies are heavily connected to ours. So the main purpose is we want to get their economy back on track so that we can make sure that our trade, our businesses in the long run don't take a hit because Britain and France can't get back on their feet. The next one on this list is something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And for some reason, I think about cereal, I guess because of Kellogg brand. Anyways, but this is a pact between countries, and specifically 15. 15 countries are going to make this promise that they are going to sign this pact, and they're promising to not go to war. As a matter of fact, we often say that this made war illegal, which is, I guess I'm just extremely judgmental here. As a teacher, I teach my kids this was probably one of the dumbest things that we ever did because there is a major problem with this. I mean, guys, it's an awesome concept. Like, hey, let's all sign this promise saying that we want peace and we're not going to go to war. Like, war is not going to, it's going to be the last resort. We're not going to be jumping into these problems. So the problem is there is no way to enforce this. And the biggest problem is a lot of countries who actually sign this pact and make this promise, well, within 20 years, they've got completely different leaders in those countries. And they look at the leaders before them that signed this pact, and they're going to be like, well, I'm not worried about that. And so we're going to see, like, eventually Germany that signs this pact, Japan who signs this pact, they're not going to honor their signature here. They're not going to honor that they promised to not go to war. So times kind of change. Leaders and positions and governments change to where they basically don't care about this. Now, one other thing, you're going to actually have to handwrite this one in because it is important, okay? We hold what's called the Washington Naval Conference. Okay, this is yet again the Kellogg-Briand Pact and this Washington Naval Conference. This is kind of our way of trying to promote peace. We didn't join the League of Nations, which was a peacekeeping organization. So this is kind of our way of like, hey, we still want peace. We still want to promote peace, but without joining the League of Nations. So, hey, let's get countries to sign saying that war is illegal. We hold this other thing called the Washington Naval Conference, where we get all the major naval powers in the world to agree to reduce their navies. This kind of goes a little bit with that militarism is kind of, instead of focusing so much on having bigger and stronger, we're going to level the playing field, kind of ease that tension and that pressure of having to have bigger and stronger militaries than other countries around the world. So That's going to be the main thing. The next topic I'm not going to address in detail because it's going to be more so in our next unit with the Roaring Twenties. But we actually do experience after World War One a Red Scare in the United States of America, where it's kind of just reality that a country has turned communist, and that's Russia. They've turned into the Soviet Union, led by Vladimir Lenin. And we actually start to see some things go on in the United States of America that when we looked at what happened in Russia right before they turned communist, those same exact things are happening in the United States. So there's actually going to be a genuine fear that there is going to be a potential communist revolution take place in our country. But a little bit more details on that in our next unit.